Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, wherever in the world you may be joining us from today. My name is Francesco Del Carpio, and I am the CFL York Operations Coordinator. I would like to officially open the sixth session of the Climate Change, Emergencies, and Cultural Heritage Speaker Series, which is being presented in partnership with Heritage Ottawa with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge and recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territory upon which our campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area is known as Takaranto and has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. As this is an online event, our participants may be joining from various locations, so I strongly encourage you to learn about the traditional land upon which you are located. With this, I welcome our moderator, our speaker, and our participants from around the world. Welcome to our webinar. Without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Monia Del Pinto. Dr. Monia Del Pinto is a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Architecture, Building, and Civil Engineering at Loughborough University, where she was recently awarded the Loughborough University Vice Chancellor Independent Research Fellowship to further her studies on urban form and disaster risk. Monia's work falls at the intersections of architecture, urban planning, heritage studies, and disaster studies, and aims at innovating methodologies and tools for effective disaster risk reduction at the urban scale. Her research on urban form and disaster risk reconceptualized spatial vulnerability in earthquake-prone settlements and developed a methodology for its assessment, which is being pilot tested in World Heritage cities exposed to climate-induced threats. Monia has professional experience in post-earthquake reconstruction in L'Aquila, is active in communication and training activities for an integrated approach to urban disaster risk management, and since 2014 has been teaching architecture-related disciplines within international and multicultural contexts between Italy, Turkey, and the UK. She is currently leading the module of disaster risk management for the built environment at Loughborough University. Monia, thank you so much for being here today and moderating this session. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well because there was a glitch in the connection. But so if everything is restored, just give me a sign. Okay. Thanks again for the introduction, and thanks Kurosh and Ali for inviting me to moderate this session, which is also the final one for 2023. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lydia Miller, who will be presenting insights from the Park Canada Climate Change Adaptation Workshops in Canada's cultural heritage places. Lydia is a chief architect for Built Heritage at Park Canada. She has a Master's of Architecture from Yale University, has practiced in New York, Alberta, and Ontario, and is a licensed architect in Ontario. At Parks Canada, she manages a team of heritage craftspeople, conservation advisors, and architects who help preserve and protect national examples of Canada's cultural heritage. The team ensures that work on heritage sites aligns with the standards and guidelines for the conservation of historic places in Canada, and that these special places are preserved for generations to come. Lydia also co-leads the Climate Change in Heritage Places dossier and supports numerous other programs administered by Park Canada's Indigenous Affairs and Cultural Heritage Directorate. Lydia's presentation today is very timely, considering the pressing need to develop context-specific participatory strategies for climate risk assessment and mitigation in heritage contexts. Before handing over to Lydia, I would just wanted to remind everyone attending the workshop that you are welcome and invited to submit your question through the Q&A or the chat box, and then I will be happy then to share them with Lydia at the end of the presentation. And now, without further ado, Lydia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Del Pinto. I'm Lydia Miller. Nice to meet you all. I'm going to share my screen here. And we will get on with the presentation. Someone could just orally tell me when you can see the full screen slide, please.
It's on.
Okay, great. So yes, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me for this last session of your series this year. I'm very happy to be participating with you all. I will keep this pretty fast-paced. Like any good architect, I love pictures, so there are lots of pictures to be seen through this. And as my colleague introduced me, I'm the chief architect for the Built Heritage team at Parks Canada. I have an incredibly rewarding and challenging job of leading a team of architects and advisors and heritage craftspeople who help preserve national examples of Canada's cultural heritage all around the country. Since about 26, well, I joined in 2016, and since then, we've really started to think a lot about climate change and how it's affecting our historic places. And one of the initiatives that we started several years ago now, which will hopefully be of interest to you today, is our conservation adaptation workshops. So I think it's fair to say the first thing that many people think of when they hear Canada is our nation's stunningly beautiful landscapes. And it's nice that we have an international crowd on this call as well. We have wilderness, we have shorelines, fields, vistas, just an incredible natural beauty all over the country from coast to coast to coast. And what's particularly interesting is really how the landscape has defined the human footprint on the land, but also how human activity has been defined by the environment. These are all Parks Canada administered places. Parks Canada, of course, has a very noble mandate. It's pretty easy to like. I've underlined some of the most important clauses of this here, and we're asked specifically to protect and present nationally significant examples of Canada's cultural heritage, and doing it in ways that ensure their ecological and commemorative integrity. Who doesn't like that? Parks Canada is the steward of 171 national historic sites across the country. You can see on this map 48 national parks and national park reserves, one national urban park, the Rouge outside of Toronto, and 4 national marine conservation areas. And many are contemplating designation right now. There are, of the 171 national historic sites, they're spread across. Parks Canada defines our operational units in about 39 distinct natural regions, and those regions have different geographies with different climatic conditions. We have national historic site managers that are in amazingly remote locations. I've worked personally on sites where we have an armed bear monitor who watches for polar bears while we fix the masonry on 17th century fortifications up on the Hudson Bay, for example. So our sites are spread far and wide across this beautiful country. An integral part of the Canadian psyche is having 4 seasons and the idea of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And whether one lives in the big cities or in rural areas, climatic conditions reign supreme. But the climate is undeniably changing. All you have to do is look outside today in Ottawa. There is no snow on the ground and it's raining, and it's December 18th. As Canadians, we are used to harsh and extreme weather, but what's noticeable more and more is that the frequency and intensity and duration of extreme weather events is changing. My colleagues in Louisbourg, Nova Scotia, which is where this photo is, at the Fortress of Louisbourg, they tell me that they're often cleaning up from one storm when another one is hitting, and they're having difficulty keeping up. I hear there's another one headed their way right now, actually. Here's a fascinating graphic that really just shows the paths that hurricanes and tropical storms have taken as they've crossed eastern Canada. You can notice that 3 of the 4 hurricanes shown have happened in the years since 2003, not to mention Dorian in 2019 and Ida in 2021 and Fiona in 2022, which was very significant to some of the East Coast National Historic Sites. And notice also on the right-hand side, this graphic from CBC News, that was showing just a 1-day rainfall total during Hurricane Igor, I think, that was in southern Newfoundland, and it got hit with hurricane winds and 238 millimeters of rain in a single day. So storms are getting worse and the storms are getting more frequent. won't be all doomsday, I promise. In central Canada, of course, in 2017 and 2019, those years marked some of the worst flooding that we've seen in a long time due to snowmelt overlapping with periods of prolonged heavy rains. And we saw flooding on some of the largest rivers in the country in those years. These are on major water courses. So this is an image of flooding on the Richelieu River at Fort Lennox. This is the slide I started with. The Richelieu is a fraction of the size of the St. Lawrence River, but it actually discharges more water than the Mississippi River in the US. There's not supposed to be water inside the moats there. So here's a photo again of the Army trying to stop some of the Ottawa River from flooding at the National Historic Site in Carillon, Quebec. Again, floods due to snowmelt and prolonged heavy rains combined. And in my job, I hear about the effects of climate change on a weekly basis. I hear about the heroic efforts and the resources being deployed to react to climate change. And I hear of folks telling me about the fatigue and the toil and the toll that this is all taking mentally. And no sooner than they can clean up from one extreme weather event, they can get hit by another. Of course, we haven't even talked about forest fires. Here's a photo of some of the fires in BC in 2017, which at the time we thought was an incredibly hard fire year. Sadly, we have loads of similar images from this year and last, which marked two of the worst ever fire seasons in Canada, sending smoke, across the continent and creating unsafe air conditions for millions of people. So fires in this part of the country have become the new normal. And now, of course, we're seeing fires regularly in other parts of the country where the threat has really never been a significant issue. Here's a photo of the first fire, one of the fires raging in 2017 near Waterton Lakes in Alberta. This is as the fires approached the town site of Waterton and the historic Prince of Wales Hotel. Although this burned through 38,000 hectares, 380 square kilometers, there was no loss of life and the hotel survived intact, but it was a really close call. And staff still talk about the emotional and the physical fatigue compounded by the last couple of years. Here's another photo from approximately just 100 kilometers up the road. And this is near the Bayou Ranch National Historic Site in Alberta. Here it's more grass and shrub fires, but they can be equally devastating. And a fire at a National Historic Site built of wood is a fire to worry about for sure. You can notice the orange sign in the board in the foreground here, and that panel says that at the time the photo was taken, the wind was running at 122 kilometers per hour. And this highlights one of the other worrying realities when one extreme weather event builds on top of another, and the cumulative effects can be even more devastating. But not all climate change effects are sudden weather events. And here are some photos of buildings in Dawson City in Yukon that have years ago distorted due to thawing permafrost. Parks Canada tried to stop the extreme decay of these buildings through various means and methods over the years with internal bracing and supports starting in the 70s. But the slow and persistent thaw of the permafrost on the foundations see that these braced buildings are settling and they have wet feet due to the thawing ground. And here's a site high above the tree line, high above the glaciers. This is, or should I now say was, sadly, the Abbott Pass Refuge Hut National Historic Site in Yoho National Park. Perhaps some of you had the amazing experience of being there when you could. Even high in the mountains, the permafrost is thawing, and you can see just the change in the glacier from those two photos. And the slopes that were once frozen and once stable for centuries now soak up the sun and have lost their stability. You may have heard that last summer we had to dismantle this building, and let me tell you, it was heartbreaking for everybody involved. This is a photo of that dismantling, and I can tell you that preparing for and managing loss is a whole other conversation, and something that we're really just starting to wrap our heads around as we face a number of climate-related realities across our portfolio that likely can't be stopped. So I could go on and on with these, but I won't. I want to focus on solutions. So in 2016, conversations started really about the need to find a more proactive way forward. And with the scale and severity of the climate change effects that you just saw, it was really becoming clear that this was a race against time. It's a race against time to raise awareness and know-how within our agency more broadly, and a race against time to curb GHG emissions and to give our heritage sites more resiliency. So we decided in 2016 to focus on finding feasible and effective solutions, and we decided to focus on the last of these three listed, the adaptation options. The first, we have an ongoing cultural resources and climate change discussion group, and the second is climate change mitigation at heritage places, which I'll speak to at the end, but we've shifted gears a bit and are focusing on number 2 a bit now. But regarding number 3, in the spirit of the let's get started, we basically proposed an expedited program of workshops, and we asked participants to help us find feasible and effective adaptation measures for climate scenarios that could play out within the next 25 years. And we use 25 years here because people have a really hard time imagining a world beyond that. It's hard for us to imagine a world beyond, 2048. And so we approached it with kind of a logical incrementalism to say, we don't know everything we need to know, but we need to get going. So we drew on a wide range of knowledge and expertise that we have at Parks Canada. And we started a series of workshops that would help us to understand climate change impacts and to develop some feasible and effective adaptation measures. So in order to do that, we thought, well, what are we talking about here? What are we looking at? So we looked at how climate change is affecting our buildings, of course. Buildings, they could be masonry, wood, log, hybrid, etc. And Parks Canada literally has thousands of them across the country. We also looked at building interiors, including art and furnishings, and how those are affected by climate change and humidity and all sorts of things like that. We looked at archaeological resources, both terrestrial and underwater. Lots of places being affected by coastal erosion, especially. We considered artifacts and collections and archives, which Parks Canada has a huge artifact collection. We're just finishing building a new massive warehouse collections facility just outside of Ottawa. We looked at engineering works, such as seawalls, shoreline stabilization, bridges, locks, other pieces of massive infrastructure. And of course, linear systems and infrastructure like roads, electrical services, drainage systems, things like that. And of course, no National Historic Site is complete without the public. So the workshops have evolved to include adaptation measures that would help address concerns for visitor safety and site staff. And you can't just look at heritage sites in isolation. They're part of larger systems. So anything and everything related to associated landscapes and cultural landscapes was fair game. So in a nutshell, we tried to design a workshop that would give us a deep enough understanding of the risks and the impacts in order to develop a suite of feasible and effective adaptation measures so we could get started addressing climate change on some of our heritage sites. So now I'll get into the nuts and bolts of the workshops themselves. Fortunately for us at the time, our colleague at Parks, Dr. Elizabeth Nelson, from what is my favorite name for a Parks Canada group called the Office of the Chief Ecosystem Scientist, OCES. They were working with the Canadian Parks Council on workshop frameworks. And so we really became their guinea pig and their test case to use their climate change adaptation framework for parks and protected areas. And this is now out in public source. So we'll put a link in the chat to this document as well. And this is what I hope that you'll be able to use in the future if you're interested. So this framework really has 5 distinct stages that guide practitioners from identifying impacts to finding adaptation options and implementing. So the 5 stages here are really about building a strong foundation, being one, and we'll go through each of these in the subsequent slides. Assessing vulnerabilities and risks, identifying and selecting adaptation options, implementing adaptation options, and monitoring and evaluating. So the first stage is really kind of pre-workshop. The assess and identify is the workshop itself, and then implementing and monitoring is kind of post-workshop, what happens after. So this methodology can be adjusted based on the scope and the scale of your specific project and the objectives of your project. It can also be applied to various resources or to a combination of them. So it could be applied. Parks Canada is continuing to do these workshops on some of our natural places. So there's a lot going on analyzing the effects of climate change on some of our natural parks and natural features across the country. And it can also be cultural, which is more what we did. It can be a combination of the two. It could be social or facilities. So it's quite adaptable. No pun intended. Here's an overview of course, the country with the 8 climate change adaptation workshops that we've held so far called out. The York Factory workshop was done remotely, and although it was somewhat useful, it was nowhere near as effective as a face-to-face session. So that's what we ended up doing for the rest of them. We tried to choose a variety of sites. You can see that this is pretty well geographically spread out, but we wanted to try to get diversity in terms of the climate change threats that we were seeing across the country, as well as different types of buildings and how they're being affected. And our hope is really to continue this program so that we have climate change workshops for historic places done for each major region in the country. So again, stage 1, that kind of pre-workshop work was about building the strong foundation. So this is about defining the scope of your project, building a team of experts and advisors, and seeking the support that you need from internal and external stakeholders. Stage 2, which is really workshop day 1, is again assessing vulnerabilities and risks, and that involves establishing a current and historical climate context and determining climate impacts and assessing the vulnerabilities and determining what are the key impacts. So kind of making a massive list of what are we seeing and then triaging those to figure out which ones are going to be the most critical for us to try to address. Stage 3, or workshop day 2, is about identifying adaptation options. And those are that's exploring a range of approaches and determining how effective they might be in reducing climate change vulnerability for the impacts that were identified the day before. So focusing on finding solutions for the key problems that were identified in workshop day 1. I can't stress enough how important it is that the workshops have a multidisciplinary approach. We have to have regional knowledge, on the ground knowledge of kind of day-to-day what's happening, absolutely critical to the conversations. We also need scientific data to base ourselves in a scientific reality so that we know what we could be facing. And we need cultural resource specialists and expertise around the table to speak to the specific resources and buildings and things that you're looking at. So here's a list of the types of people that we hope to involve in a typical workshop. They could involve climate scientists and specialists, asset managers, project managers, maintenance staff, visitor experience specialists, collections and curatorial specialists, conservation architects, cultural resource managers and advisors, archaeologists, ecologists, and other natural resource conservation specialists, and anyone else that might have relevant information for the resources that you're discussing. We also had a professional writer at our workshops, and that's how we ended up with the reports that I can also share a link to that you can check out. But I wanted to highlight here the ones in red. These are really the most important are making sure that you have people who know the sites and manage things on a day-to-day basis. So all voices are equal and all voices are critically important to the process, but it's really important to make sure that you're grounded in the realities and have a good understanding of the problems that you're trying to solve. So fortunately for us, the Office of the Chief Ecosystem Scientist had Dr. Scott Parker working on a series called Let's Talk About Climate Change. And these were backgrounders for the different regions across Canada. These were really clear and user-friendly compilations of relevant scientific information done by region. And now we actually they've shortened these up, and we have kind of 2-pagers that they use as summaries for the regions, showing the climate trends. But this was some of the key information that we used for each of the workshops. Here are some examples of the information that Scott pulled together and made available to us. These were kind of foundation stones to the CCAW workshops. And here's a close-up of a site-specific page where Scott draws out, as best he can, the climate data for a specific site. This was for Dawson City. And I'll just pause for a second to highlight inside that circle that according to the peer-reviewed best information Scott was able to find, projections for Dawson City were for 10 to 14 degrees Celsius average winter temperature increase by 2100. That's a lot of change of temperature for a place like Dawson City. And obviously, in this particular instance, permafrost thaw was one of the biggest climate change impacts that we were seeing. It also says there's 66% winter increase in precipitation. So you can see that places like that are definitely going to be changing. And it's important to have some of those things in your mind when you're talking about resiliency for these assets. It's also really important to try to define your study scope before the workshop begins. We were learning on the fly, and this was something that we learned quite quickly, which was when your study area becomes too big, the conversations can't really be contained to 1 day or 2 days. So just trying to define better what particular assets or buildings or resources you're actually trying to study. So in this case, we were looking at a dozen or so, I guess almost 20, 21 buildings in Dawson City. And we used this so that people, we issued this in advance so people could kind of prepare themselves and bring to the table any relevant information and get that ready for the workshop. So in the weeks before the workshop, we like to load up a shared server location with reading material. So we just kind of created some shared folders online and put in, climate backgrounders, heritage reports, and any other documents and studies, as well as site photographs and orientation material that we thought that everyone would find interesting and helpful for the conversations. Before the workshops proper, we found it was really important to have some sort of site familiarization tour that was led by, in our case, local field units. And this is a really important piece so that we could hear exactly and see what people are seeing and experiencing on the ground on a site level on a day-to-day and season-to-season basis. So these were very valuable. And again, that's why, although we tried to do one of the workshops in a virtual way, this kind of boots on the ground visual analysis is quite helpful. In the morning of day 1 of the workshop, we do introductions. And this is an overview of the process. This doesn't take super long. This is really just like a 30 to 60 minute intro. This is what we're going to do. This is the structure of the next couple of days, and let everyone kind of get familiar with one another and introduce themselves and try to explain to one another what perspective they're bringing to the conversation. And then, of course, we get going. We've designed the climate change workshops. So on the first morning, the field unit has a lot of time, or whoever's most familiar with the site that you're studying can share and continue to share from the day before what they're seeing and what they're experiencing. And a lot of times they'll kind of prepare a presentation in advance to say, here are some photos of what we're seeing in terms of climate change effects on these buildings. They also often share what they've tried and didn't work, and that's very valuable too. And maybe what hunches or thoughts they have with regards to the next steps and the best ways forward, and how they've been managing things or how they think they should be managing things. So just kind of getting it all out on the table from the local perspective. Then we put up the climate change scientists. So that's Scott Parker standing there. And they talk about the site's historical and projected climate trends. So this was quite important because it really starts to help people understand the gravity of the situation. As I said, you want there to be people coming to the table from all different perspectives. So the majority of them probably aren't really going to understand what the climate impacts in the next 15 to 20 to 25 years look like. So it's important to have this presented and kind of keep ourselves grounded in the science of this at the beginning. And this really starts to help people envision what might come to pass in that area in the future. So you're probably, given the group on this call, familiar with these climate drivers. These drivers are based on NRCan's 2016 publication on managing climate risk. These workshops really begin by discussing the historical climate trends and the future climate change projections for the region. And so we use these same 5 drivers in our workshops as well. So these 5 drivers obviously can be linked to a number of different climate scenarios. And these are the plausible future climate change scenarios based on those different categories. So we start the workshops by kind of, what are we talking about? I'll just flip back a slide, but depending on the region, we might not be talking about sea level rise because we might be in the prairies and it might not have any sea that we're talking about. So, in that case, we might only be focusing on 3 of these. And then once we get into climate change scenarios, we might not need to talk about storm surge or coastal erosion. So it kind of helps us pare down what are the climate trends and scenarios that we should be focusing on. And then in the afternoon of day 1, we brainstorm a list of impacts. So this is the fundamental question to the field units here is, what have you been experiencing in the way of climate change effects, and what can we predict you will be experiencing in the future? So this is kind of a fun participatory section of the workshop. There's a lot of sticky notes and a lot of conversations going on, and a very active and engaging part of the workshop. And we, as you can see, this is just one increased precipitation and increased temperature page. And you can see, there's just dozens of things that people are brainstorming about what kind of impacts there would be based on those 2 drivers. So we check in with our cards, and this is something that we haven't really kind of published, but we found that it's helped us a little bit, that when people get stuck, we have a series of these cards that we've created that are used just to kind of prompt people to think about some specific things. So once we let people do their own brainstorming for quite a while, if we think that they're kind of slowing down on things, we go around and we bring some of these cards out, and we might share them with people, and they can look at things like, if they have an impact around poor drainage, here are some ideas that they can think about. For example, do they have soil destabilization and shifting and heaving and landslide and subsidence, and what that might affect? Or do they have cracks in buildings infrastructure and what that might affect? So These are just kind of prompt cards to make sure that we're not missing out on anything. And on average, we've been getting from the group about 75 to 100 impacts per workshop, which has been pretty good. So once we have this list of impacts on those sticky notes, we try to understand what is the likelihood of these impacts and the consequence of them. So for each scenario, we would ask, if scenario X were to occur, and we look at likelihood on the y-axis and consequence on the x, what is the likelihood of the impact? Is it rare? Is it unlikely, possible, likely, or almost certain? And so you kind of rank that, is it possible? Where does that lie on the y-axis? And then if that were to happen, what is the consequence of that impact? Is it negligible, minor, moderate, major, or catastrophic? So then that combination of things on this matrix will give you an overall risk level being low, moderate, high, or extreme. So just as an example, to help you kind of illustrate this a little bit more, we might look at an impact like poor drainage, leading to water pooling around building foundations. So almost, if you look at the likelihood of that, they might say, well, that's almost certain. We know that that's already happening, right? So if that's an almost certain, that's going to be that bottom line, right, across the horizontal bottommost line. And then if you think about, okay, if you did have poor drainage and water leading to pooling around building foundations, what would be the consequence of that? And we might say, well, that's probably going to be, a pretty major consequence, could be catastrophic depending. So that would put us, if you combine those two rankings, into the high or extreme level of overall risk. So we take all of these sticky notes with these impacts, and then we rank them on this type of scale so that we can batch them into, these are low risk impacts, or moderate or mediate or high or extreme risk impacts. Because really what we want to focus on going to the next stage of the workshop is, let's just focus on the things that landed in the high or extreme category, because we only have so much time, and the things that are lower risk overall, perhaps we don't address right away. So understanding the risk of the impacts then allows us to choose which ones to focus on, as I said, with the little time available. So we look at what are the impacts for priority attention, and what are the impacts worthy of longer term consideration, because obviously we're not going to solve all of these or come up with all the best solutions in one afternoon. And there might also be impacts that we need to put aside. We found in a couple of instances that we realized, oh, geez, this is an issue that we really need a specialist for, who we didn't know that we should have invited to this workshop. So sometimes there are things that you just need to make a note to put aside and consider that separately. So that's kind of the day one scenario. And then we go into day two, which again is really about identifying and selecting adaptation options. So if you think of it as we define the problems on day one, this day two is really about trying to identify possible solutions. So here we explore a range of approaches, and we determine how effective they are in reducing climate change vulnerability. So in the morning of day two, we jump right into the development of the adaptation options. And this is kind of the main event. And again, this is another very interactive brainstorming. We typically take one impact per table, and we have people in kind of breakout groups, and they're brainstorming together on different impacts. So we try to get people to understand, because again, not everyone is a climate change specialist who's at this, nor would we want them to be. But we get them to understand that adaptation is different than mitigation, and that our focus here is revolving around those definitions. So we do explain, of course, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change definition as adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli and their effects or impacts. And that adaptation really involves changes in processes, practices, and structures to moderate potential damages or to benefit from the opportunities associated with climate change. Sometimes this is kind of foreign to people, so it helps to get them in a frame of mind that's trying to get them to understand what adaptation is. A lot of people think that mitigation and GHG reductions is what we're focusing on, but these specific workshops are really about adaptation. So we talk a bit about some of the most common adaptation approaches. We could have proactive actions like retrofits, protective elements, reactive actions, which is what unfortunately we see a lot of, restoration or reconstruction. And then, of course, kind of desperate measures of relocation, documentation, loss, as I mentioned, habit pass, dismantling, things like that. The U.S. National Park Service has actually done a lot of work. I'm sure, given the people on this call, you're familiar with them and their work, but they define 7 adaptation options as the option of no active intervention being an option. That one is hard for people to kind of grapple with. Offsetting stress, so removing or deflecting stress from a distance. Improving resilience and or resistance, so improving the ability of a resource to withstand stress. Managing change, so incorporating change into management approaches. Relocating or facilitating movement of a resource. Documenting and preparing for loss. Again, that's a hard one for people to accept. And of course, interpreting the change. And that can be combined with any of the treatments. But in terms of awareness, I think that's really a very important one. So for the development of adaptation options to work, we asked the participants to kind of shelve their preconceptions and to hear out the comments of those around the table, whether it's the vice president or the guy who cuts the grass that's talking. They're all equally important perspectives. That, curiously, is not the major hurdle. I think the hardest thing for people to consider is understanding or thinking about the range of options and how things will look in 20 or 30 years' time. So in this graphic, we try to help them just get a very simplistic understanding of adaptation options, where, of course, on the leftmost side, we have no intervention. We have our little hut on the coast and the water. One over from that is about protection. So maybe that's a seawall or some sort of barrier that will keep rising water levels at bay. Or there's an accommodation option. So that might mean, okay, we take our little structure and we put it up on stilts above the high water mark. Or, of course, there could be some sort of retreat option and moving it away from the coast edge. So though very simplistic, this does help people kind of think, oh, okay, now I kind of know what adaptation is. Nevertheless, once you get talking about things, people have come up with, again, about 75 to 100 different adaptation measures per workshop. So that's a pretty good number for 2 days of people just brainstorming together. So once you have these adaptation options, kind of pseudo solutions to the problems, you kind of need to score them in terms of their effectiveness and their feasibility so that you know which ones are the best ones to start doing. So we didn't want to leave people after the workshop with just this massive list of things that they could do. We wanted to try to help them prioritize this list. So we ranked the adaptation measures. And in order to do this, you can see, again, we have kind of a matrix here where we have feasibility on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, and effectiveness on the x. So we would take any of these options, and we would rank them in terms of how effective it is, how feasible it is. And so in our example of, we talked about earlier, poor drainage leading to water pooling around a building foundation. So one adaptation option might have been, we could add foundation drainage like a French drain, and we could regrade with a negative slope away from the building. Well, if we rank that in terms of feasibility, that's pretty highly feasible. That's not, moving mountains. And if we rank that in terms of effectiveness, that's also quite high. That would do a pretty good job in terms of keeping water from pooling right around the building. So I would say that would probably rank as an option in the upper right-hand quadrant. If you talked about an option like lifting the building up by 5 feet, depending on what the building's made out of, that could be a much less feasible option. It could be just as effective in the end, but say it's a mass masonry stone building, you're going to have it very low on the effectiveness scale on the bottom left. And maybe if it would be, in the feasibility scale rather. But if you actually did it, it would actually be pretty effective. So, that might be something that ends up on the, the lower right-hand side. So just so that you understand. And so what we ended up doing was we wanted to leave people focusing on this kind of upper right-hand quadrant of solutions. So we built this master list of adaptation measures. And as you can see, and imagine having someone who's a scribe for your group to help articulate all this and put it into little tables as you go, makes things much easier than transcribing all of the sticky notes afterwards. But we sorted that by impact type. And then within the impact type, we would sort it by the color-coded options so that the impact type would include descriptions of the adaptation measure, the advantages of the current approach, the disadvantages of the current approach, and a revised approach if necessary, and additional thoughts. So we basically end up with this color-coded master list, and when we leave, the group running the site could be focusing largely on the feasible and effective and high-risk items that were shown in green. So again, red was really not that recommendable, but we still wanted to make sure that we track those things because they're still ideas. They might have value in the future. Yellow needs further study, and green was recommendable. And then at the bottom, we would have some next steps where applicable. So just on the last couple of slides here, we think it's really hugely important that we documented the whole thing so that we don't lose the ideas that were tabled, especially since we're likely to be back for round 2 with these groups in years future. I'm pleased to report that this kind of simple and humble approach and workshop strategy has proven pretty successful. At the very least, it's really helped people to talk about what we're seeing and where we're likely to be going. So we have the reports from these 8 workshops and a summary report available online on OpenGov. We'll share the link with you. I encourage you to read them. They're in French and in English. Those were done in support of the Federal Provincial Territorial Working Group on Cultural Heritage. And we also know the more workshops we have, the more we're building a volume of information related to climate change risk and climate change adaptation measures. So going back to a slide you saw earlier, we still need to continue discussions, number one. I think this type of lectures is quite helpful in your series as well. Mitigation, we absolutely need to do what we can to reduce greenhouse gases. We have, the initial push of this adaptation workshop series was stymied, like so many things, by the pandemic. So at that point, we kind of shifted at Parks Canada a bit, and we've been looking at focusing on number 2 about mitigation a little bit more. We're undertaking some life cycle analysis and doing some embodied carbon measurements on a pilot project. We're also working with the National Research Council to look at our whole heritage portfolio and what kinds of strategies we should be trying to apply at a portfolio level, in terms of making energy improvements. Where should we do it, and also where should we not be doing it when it comes to heritage places. So that's a very interesting bit of work, and I hope to share that with you in various fora in the next few years. But of course, number 3, we need to continue to move through these feasibility studies and effectiveness, adaptation measures to make our sites more resilient in the face of climate change. And I hope that you can use this climate change adaptation framework in your own sites and your own workshops. So that about sums it up. I hope some of this proves useful and you might be able to apply this to your work. Thank you very much for your time. I think I'll turn it back to Dr. Del Pinto and we'll take some questions.
Thank you, Lydia. It was super interesting because a lot of what I've seen matches what I'm doing and what our colleagues everywhere are doing right now. So it's clear how the problem is globally acknowledged, and the shared participatory approach is probably one of the most, I don't want to make it easy, but one of the probably most effective ways of at least narrowing the problems at the context, at the scale of the context. Actually, we have 3 questions now for you. So I think I'm going to start with the questions from the audience, and then we can go through the documents that you kindly shared, so that there might be intersections with the questions, with the answers and the content of the reports, probably. So the first question that I have in the Q&A is from Ali, and he asks, how do you assess the importance of visual inspection in terms of sensitivity analysis? I think this is a bit specific. So I don't know if he needs elaborating on that, or if it's kind of something that you feel like is possible to answer at this stage.
It's a good question. I'm not quite sure what you mean by sensitivity analysis, but I would assume that's in relation to kind of what is the designation and the importance of that cultural resource that you're talking about. It's absolutely important. I think all of these things that we're talking about, these workshops are kind of at a higher level than a super site specific level. So it depends. Again, as I said at the beginning, you can apply this methodology just to one building if you really wanted to get into kind of a micro scale and really talk about, exactly what you're seeing. And you could say, like, you could spend a whole day talking about just this building, and that you're seeing condensation on the windows on the east facade, and and you could really get into that at that scale. And then you would absolutely, you'd need to have your analysis done on kind of a current condition assessment and what are the issues that you're seeing at that level of granularity. What we were doing is almost always in these instances looking at a much broader site. So we had, whether it was 5 to 20 buildings that we were looking at. So sometimes it was the site of a township. Other times it was, a cluster or a complex of buildings. So where the actual condition of those buildings came into play was when we were doing those site visits and the walk around visits and hearing from people exactly what they're seeing. So in a lot of times they were pointing out, visual specific issues that they were having with some buildings. And then we were trying to address those as best we could in the coming days. So it's a pretty versatile workshop methodology that I think can work at various scales, at even kind of the urban scale down to an individual building.
Thank you, Lydia. Sorry. I have 2 more questions. So the next one is from Frank, and he asks, please, how does, in your definition, the regional knowledge separate or differ from the cultural knowledge in this context? So, because I assume the adoption of the regional knowledge definition.
Yeah, that's a good question. So every organization will work differently, but the way that Parks Canada works is that we are broken down into those 37 or 39 different geographic regions called field units. And each of those regions operates with kind of its own autonomy and its own budget and it's like its own little business unit. And so that is kind of what we were calling regional knowledge, because those are the people that are on the ground working day to day with the sites and on the sites and seeing what's happening. Parks Canada also has a different level of governance called National Office, which is where my group sits. And we support all of the field units across the country. So we have kind of a higher, broader scope because we work with all those groups. We get to see what's happening all across the country. And in addition to my group of conservation architects, there's a very important group called Cultural Resource Management. And the CRM team is that kind of individual group that pulls together who are the functional specialists that we need at the table and what kind of expertise do we need. So they might say, given the specific site we're looking at, we need an archaeologist, we need an historian, we need an architect, and we need a cultural resource management specialist. And maybe we also they have a big collection, so maybe we need a preventative conservation scientist, all of which we are lucky enough to have at Parks Canada. So that's kind of what I was considering like the cultural knowledge of that functional specialists that have that level of expertise, as opposed to the regional knowledge, which is the kind of boots on the ground, what are we seeing? And that's not to say that they don't necessarily have knowledge and cultural resources as well. Sometimes the field units do, but most of the time those are people who are operating the buildings, running the locks, the operational side of things.
Thank you. The third and final question is from Douglas, and he asks, to what extent is the large holistic idea of humanity now being the number one force affecting global environmental system, i.e. the Anthropocene, encouraging Parks Canada to envision and work towards strategies that go beyond incremental strategies at heritage site, towards transformative strategies for regional and global systems? It's a bit of an articulated one.
Geez, I've been out of academia for too long. No, that's a good question. I mean, I think we all get a little bit buried in our own rabbit hole sometime of focused on what it is that we are trying to do and we are trying to protect. But it absolutely is a much bigger problem and a much more global. It requires a global solution. I think, things like this and just exchanging information, even if it's just within Canada, is a part of this. I think, going to international conferences and taking virtual, learning from different groups. There are now a lot of groups that are talking about this. And I think at this stage, for me at least, it's really trying to learn about what these other groups are doing and other countries are doing and try to figure out, can we apply that to what we're doing, and not reinventing the wheel all the time, because we can't just sit down and think, well, we need to invent a system to do this when 10 other countries did that 10 years ago. So I think sharing knowledge has got to be a really critical piece to this in terms of approaching it in a holistic way.
Thank you, Lydia. I'm conscious of time, and I think after 3 questions we can actually conclude the Q&A. It's 6 p.m. But thanks a lot, and there are so many points here that are valuable. It seems we're constantly reinventing the wheel to some extent if you don't connect and we don't create a network. So this is a great point to conclude to end the presentation. Francesco, I think if you want to say something, or Ali, or anyone else. Over to you.
Thank you. Ali, did you want to go ahead? Or
I just want to say thank you, Lydia. This was amazing and lots of information. We are really happy to hear such a great workshops happening and hope to be able to cover some of them in future sessions. And definitely those are of interest if we go into details of them. I mean, this is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Back to you, Francesco.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, just to echo the thanks. Thank you so much, Lydia, for the great presentation, for sharing all the information about the workshops. Thank you, Monia, for moderating today. And thank you, of course, to everyone in the audience for being here and for supporting this series. And so just as a reminder to everyone, this is the final series or session for the year, but we'll be continuing with this series in the new year. So we hope that everyone is able to come back and continue participating in this series in January after the holiday break. And with that, just like to end with one last big thank you to everybody. I hope everybody has a great holiday season.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.